Hey folks, welcome to the Unity 2020 Campfire. I am very pleased to be joined by Melissa Chen, who is the New York editor for The Spectator USA, and Matt Taibbi, who is a reporter at Rolling Stone and can also be found on Substack. Melissa and I are big fans of your Substack, Matt, so I hope people will join it and read and be as delighted as we are with it.
Thank you.
Welcome to both of you.
Thank you for having us on.
So, there's a lot going on in the land of Unity at the moment, not all of it good. Some of it, however, is excellent. This week, we held a ranked choice vote, and we determined which ticket it is that we intend to draft. The ticket we settled on is Tulsi Gabbard and Dan Crenshaw, and so that's a big accomplishment. First of all, ranked choice voting, I don't know if you guys have engaged in any ranked choice voting, but it felt a great deal different than regular voting because one knows that the preferences are accounted for at a much deeper level. And so one of the things that Unity 2020 certainly stands for is an increase in the quality of our electoral system, including things like ranked choice voting. Do you guys have any experience along those lines?
Melissa?
I know New York started doing that. I've personally never voted that way, but I like the idea of, the little scantrons you get and shading and just ranking your priorities, because at the end of the day, like we all have certain priorities that are not accounted for in a winner takes all system, and we're forced to be pragmatic. So I'm a huge fan of ranked choice voting. It's something that I think will fully capture people's desires and more fully represents our democracy or democratic intents. So it's something that, I don't know, the country really should move towards.
Yep, I agree. How about you, Matt? While we're talking, I'm going to light a couple of candles. We've sort of taken it on as a tradition so that we have a little bit of fire associated with our metaphorical campfire. I'm not sure if it makes a difference, but it seems sort of thematically right.
Excellent.
I want to make s'mores, though.
You are more than welcome to, but if we are going to partake, they have to be gluten-free. Okay. So.
Yeah, when I lived in Russia, they had some ranked choice voting in certain elections, and it seemed like a better system than ours on a number of levels. So, it's pretty clear that the way we do, especially presidential elections now in the States, is a completely dysfunctional system, and we need some kind of improvement on it, especially to avoid situations like this year where people are left with nothing like a good choice. So I think that's something that should really be explored.
So let's talk a little bit about this year. How do you see it shaping up at the moment? I mean, obviously, you're both here, and I should probably leave it to you to say, but Matt, you have formally endorsed Unity 2020 even before we had figured out what ticket we intended to draft. Melissa, are you on board with the idea of Unity, assuming that we can get our ticket to the ballot?
Yes, 100%. 100%. And I mean, it just viscerally resonates with me, just the whole concept of it. So, yes.
Terrific. And what are you seeing in the election, assuming we take Unity out of the question? What are you seeing in the election at the moment?
Well, for me, I look at the situation right now, and it reminds me a lot of the stretch run of 2016, except some of the factors that we were looking at back then have become amplified, almost parodized this time around. I mean, if we think about what was going on 4 years ago, roughly this week, you might remember Hillary Clinton was making that comment about how half of Donald Trump supporters were deplorable, a basket of deplorables, and irredeemable. And the other, she did speak about another basket of people who we needed to understand and empathize with, but that's mostly been memory hold. What we remember is that deplorable comment, which it's interesting. She got killed for saying it in the time, that people said it was an unforced error and that it was a huge mistake to insult the electorate that way, and that she should focus on Trump and try to court those voters. But 4 years later, the idea that not only Trump and not only his voters, but basically the entire United States of America is deplorable, past and present, is basically the formal platform of the Democratic Party. And it's almost like they've adopted the nadir of their 2016 strategy, as their operating philosophy going forward. And even though they're ahead in the polls, the whole thing just doesn't make me feel good about what might happen in November, because they just don't have a lot of margin of error. There aren't going to be any Republican votes for the Democrats. Independents don't seem to be leaning towards Biden. So I know it's a tough call. I mean, I think Trump will lose, but it feels to me like it's going to be way closer than it should be.
Well, I actually don't feel like he's going to lose at this point. I feel real concerned that he might win by a substantial margin. I will say the basket of deplorables comment was maybe the iconic moment in that election cycle. It really revealed the game plan and how foolish it was. And this time around, it is just stunning. There is no policy being discussed at all. I mean, it's not like it's not mentioned, but the argument in favor of Biden really is that he's not Trump, and that's about it. And people even seem comfortable with the substantial evidence of cognitive decline, as if party rule is acceptable somehow in the U.S. So I'm flabbergasted at what a weak campaign the Democrats are running. I'm sorry, I interrupted you, Melissa.
No. Well, I was going to say, I was one of those people who were just shocked at the results last year. On November 4th, I was just taken aback by the results. The press was saying one thing, and I had just expected Trump to lose. It was just like a given. And by that time, I was living in New York City, and I remember I had some friends down in the Javits Center, and they were calling me and describing the scenes around the area. You saw some of it on Twitter, where clips of people just crying and just screaming into the sky. And I was one of those people who was shocked. So what's interesting is, obviously hindsight is 2020. And when you look back, you see exactly what Matt was describing, which is we seem to be running into the same currents that were building up to 2016. The country is as polarized as ever, if not way more. You also see, actually, what's different this time is also that what was quite a fringe issue in 2016, which was cancel culture, is now very mainstream. So the stuff that happened to you, Bret, was a fringe story in 2016. I think maybe only Tucker Carlson covered it. And right now, what happened to you is everywhere, and it's actually a mainstream talking point. So it's really percolated up into the public consciousness. So what we're seeing now is more of a delta between perception and reality, what people are willing to say privately and what people are willing to say publicly. And so I'm not confident in terms of, it seems like the forces that were there in 2016 are just animating the situation far more aggressively right now in 2020. So I'm kind of with you on this. I actually won't be surprised if Trump wins again.
Yeah, just to piggyback on what Melissa's saying, that we've seen some studies. I think the Cato Institute did a poll that showed, enormous numbers of people have political opinions that they're afraid to share right now, which makes it a very problematic thing to have any confidence in any of the polling, which was bad enough last time. An underrated aspect of what happened in 2015 and 16 was the total failure of the data journalists who exist basically to act as a check on people like me, right? Who are making sort of traditional punditry calls about who's going to win and lose. And back then they really should have been looking. First of all, they miscalled the nomination completely, even though there was significant evidence that he was going to win the nomination pretty early, and they insisted that he couldn't do that. And then as the general election season progressed, we saw all these signs that were really troubling on the Clinton front, like the fact that she only broke 10,000 in her crowds once. She had empty seats down the home stretch in almost all of her appearances. Her campaign was putting out statements about how they weren't trying for big crowds and that's why they weren't getting them. And Trump, meanwhile, was filling stadiums with 35,000. He had this rolling road show. So, and yet the polls were showing that it wasn't going to be close, which to me should have been an indicator that something was off. And we're seeing a lot of those same indicators this time. I haven't seen a Biden sign anywhere really, right? And do you know anybody who's like an enthusiast for Biden? I mean, I know people who intend to vote for him, but they don't love him, which is always a big problem for a presidential candidate.
I think it's literally true. I've never met one. Go ahead, Melissa.
But there's a lot of righteous sort of moral outrage, though, in the sense of, you're right, there's no like crazy for Biden voter. I haven't met one. But there's a lot of people who are adamant that if you don't even vote Biden, you are guilty of ushering in the Third Reich or, basically the Nazis. So there's enough righteous anger on Biden's side. I would also say that I think this election cycle has had quite a few black, even white swans. So if the pandemic kind of happened a little later, yeah, Trump was going to lose. He handled it, pretty badly by most accounts. But the riots and the sort of the way the press has been playing a role in covering this seems to be tipping it a little further. If you look at the latest trends in polling, it seems like Trump is gaining a little ground. So that's another one of those things that, just the news cycle is gonna push this one way.
So I want to ask you about unity in the context of this very odd election cycle. So you have both now seen some of the pushback that unity gets. And I must say the amount of bile contained in some of the pushback is even throwing me for a loop. It's shocking how much people who hate it really hate it. Now, that said, there are a huge number of people who really like it. I mean, it's got thousands of volunteers working overtime. So it's captured the imagination of many people, which I think is in part what's fueling some of the hatred, is that there's an understanding that actually it breaks a certain spell. You can't do this. Why can't you do it? You can't do it because you'll spoil the election. oh, but unity is constructed so that it doesn't spoil the election, which means suddenly the go-to argument has evaporated, right? And so either that go-to argument needs to be reinvigorated or something has to replace it. And there's no agreement on what that something is. So what is standing in its place is vitriol. Do you have anything useful to say about the nature of that vitriol, or what role it's playing? How many people does it drive away who actually would have ears to hear that there was an alternative, if only it weren't for the fact that there were people screaming that you can't touch that thing?
Melissa, do you want to?
All right, I'll go first. One of the things that I've seen in terms of the outrage is people calling this completely irresponsible. We're only 2 months out. And then I explained, well, but there is a fail-safe. And actually in your video, when you explained it, you said there was a double fail-safe. The recent piece, which you shared, Bret, by Bridget Fedesi, she said, if she explained why she's not voting. I mean, in reality, she's actually going to be voting down ballot. It's not that she's not voting in general, but she said that if Trump wins, America burns. If Trump loses, America burns. And that sentiment, which is why we should be trying to walk away from this two-party dominance, look to boosting some other, some third party. This sentiment rests on this moral equivalence that a lot of people are not comfortable making, because in that, is that assumption that, yeah, America's going to burn otherwise, but you're morally equating two candidates. And so I've noticed the righteous anger usually is coming from the people that really think Trump is ushering fascism and really need to be taken down, no matter what, rather than thinking long term in terms of this is about challenging the two-party system in this country and getting more people what they want and getting government to really represent people's wishes.
Well, before you jump in, Matt, I just want to pick up on a theme of yours, Melissa, which is, perfectly reflected in Bridget's article, that there are a lot of people who look at this and they see no win. And so not voting seems like some kind of answer. But why do that? And in fact, I contacted her afterwards and I said, as long as you're not going to vote, you might as well join us, because the fact is this offers an alternative, and it may be a long shot, but what makes it a long shot is actually just the inability of people to suspend their disbelief. The fact is disaffected voters represent a huge potential voting bloc, and unity actually motivates them. Something like 25% of our volunteers are drawn from amongst people who wouldn't have voted otherwise. So it's bringing many people back into the fold. If those people simply voted against the duopoly, then we'd win. And so there's a question about, can we reach that vast group that is not apathetic, but disaffected, with the message, hey, this is time for the extraordinary play. And if you'll go along with this extraordinary play, it can actually happen. I really think that's the message we need to reach people with. We don't even need to win over Democrats or Republicans. We just simply need to win over the people who understand that there's no win in the standard system and have become disgusted by it.
Yeah, if you look at one of the biggest sort of propaganda objectives in traditional campaign journalism is hammering the quote unquote fringe political movements and making sure that the lion's share of the blame for what journalists perceive to be adverse political results goes to people like Jill Stein or Ralph Nader, and the vitriol that's always been dealt in that direction never really made any sense statistically. Like, if you look at what happened in 2016, there were 100 million people who were eligible to vote who did not. That was 43% of the electorate, which dwarfs the number that voted for either Clinton or Trump. I think Clinton's numbers were just over 28% total, and Trump's were, I think, 27.3. If you add in the other candidates who got into the race, which I think was an additional 6 million votes or so, you were nearly doubling up the winning result with people who didn't cast a vote for a traditional party. And so the sort of massive amounts of disbelief in the system, which I think are reflected in these numbers of people who don't vote. If you look at the polls, the number one reason people don't vote is that they don't think their vote counts. There's a sizable percentage that also thinks the system is corrupt. There's another percentage that, like I think it's around 8%, that feels like they don't have time to vote. They're too busy. They're working multiple jobs. They don't think it's going to have an effect. And the reason that, and I hate to go on about this, but one of the reasons that campaign journalists don't know about this is because they're never exposed to non-voters in the course of covering campaigns. They go from event to event, and the only people they ever meet are people with an intense interest in the process. They're either aides or donors or campaign staffers on the plane, or they go to an event where they're either running into protesters or partisans. Which is one reason why, I years ago, I used to do this thing where I get to the event and I'd run a mile in any direction and just start talking to people, and you hear completely different answers about how people feel about the process. So, something like Unity is, it just has to get over the threshold of being understood as viable. And that's why, the amount of pushback from traditional press outlets and from social media is going to be so intense, because this is all this is about belief. If that huge pocket of non-voters is held back by their belief that they don't have anything to participate to add, or they don't have any options, then you got to keep them in that place in order to keep the system in place.
Well, and in 2016, like the last election, we did see the highest voter total and percentage of votes too for the Libertarian Party, right? Gary, Aleppo Johnson actually earned like one of the highest votes I think ever for a Libertarian Party. So, and Bret, from what I understand, because I was trying to understand the ballot access point that you were trying to make, and that is that part of Unity's ballot access is actually convincing either the Green Party or Libertarian Party to run the Unity ticket. Is that correct?
That is correct. And, at first that may sound far-fetched to people, and of course we've gotten pushback on it. But the thing is, those parties cannot win the election on their own. Whereas if they were to team up, ideally, both parties could join the Unity ticket, which would, A, call attention to the fact that we are in a national emergency, and that the Libertarians and the Greens recognize it, even if the Republicans and Democrats don't. But B, the advantage that would come to a third party that joined with us would be huge in future elections. It would really be a mechanism for escaping the bulwark that the major parties have set up to prevent third parties from being viable. So this is in some sense their chance to break out of the trap that has kept them as a sideshow. And, whether they will be able to see that, I don't know. But I think in their shoes, I would see it very clearly, that this is an opportunity that not only is this a moment at which one's patriotism should drive them to make such a sacrifice, but long-term it isn't a sacrifice. Long-term it's a win for those parties. So I hope that they do see it, and that would allow us to get on the ballot and be viable pretty well instantly. And, if you think about the difference between a Joe Jorgensen ticket and its likelihood of winning, or a Howie Hawkins ticket and its likelihood of winning, versus a Tulsi Gabbard, Dan Crenshaw ticket, if we were to draft them, Tulsi Gabbard and Dan Crenshaw are broadly resonant, and the team is even more. It's electrifying. That's what we found amongst people who are paying attention to Unity, who really are a very balanced group across the political spectrum is that they find the idea of this team electrifying because, for one thing, we know they get along, they like each other, they're capable of collaborating, and because we really do have a member from the left and from the right, everybody knows their interests are represented.
Yeah. Also, a lot of modern media and politics are predicated on the idea that there can never be any realistic cooperation between Republicans and Democrats, and especially in the Trump era, as you point out, Melissa, it's not just viewed as bad politics or eccentric to consider collaboration with the other side, or to consider not voting for, for instance, the Democrats. You're actively participating in a white supremacist experiment, or the most extreme possible rhetoric is dealt out to anybody who thinks about the concept of collaborating. But that's also what turns off so many voters about what's going on right now. Like if you listen to people in the audiences of all these different candidates during the primary season, the number one thing they all said is that they're just so tired of the rancor. And yeah, I mean, like Dan Crenshaw isn't my idea of a politician, right? But I do love the idea of a system that forces two erstwhile adversaries to come up with a collective solution, and I think that would be appealing to a lot of people at this time who are so tired of the culture war.
Yeah, I think the ticket is great on two counts. Dan kind of came on my radar when that whole thing with Pete Davidson at SNL happened. And, it was a very heartwarming moment when he went on and accepted the apology, and they kind of did, he did this riff where he kind of took one for the team and just kind of like insulted Pete Davidson back. And it was just a nice kind of coming together, right? And Dan really, like, his profile was raised after that incident. So in a way, like, he kind of came into the public's view through that story of in a way unity. And in Tulsi's case, I think it's so clear that she really was a thorn in the DNC side, and she was such a different candidate that she kind of rose through the ranks through a lot of outside media, alternative media, because of people like Joe Rogan, you and Eric Weinstein. I think it really raised Tulsi and Andrew Yang to a good extent. Their stories wouldn't have been possible in a way, I think, if not for alternative media. So she really kind of represents a threat to the two-party system. And you can't really put her in a box either, which is what's really interesting. And in a way, it's representing some sort of realignment in our politics. So I find that somehow through the ranked choice voting that Unity conducted, that it was these two candidates that filtered to the top. I find that kind of symbolic and poetic in a way, representing what Unity is supposed to be.
Yeah, I agree with you. Now, I should say this is structured as a draft, as it has to be.
Okay.
These people are both viable members of their parties, and Unity is not in a position to draft them yet. We have to get there. And so, in any case, I very much hope that we do, which goes back to the question of how can we catalyze people's imagination so that they can see it. But I think what people need to realize is that that's all that has to happen. And if you think about all of the things that you thought were impossible 2 years ago that have happened in the meantime, right? The number of times that we've just simply had to accept usually a very negative change in our standing. The fact is, it is possible for a population to come to realize that things are not what they thought. And in this case, it could be extremely positive. It could be absolutely cathartic for the nation. And come January, we could actually be, out of this very dark period and headed in a positive direction, if only people can see it.
What's at stake is like, I just want to kind of, I wish I could like upregulate this message too, that, at the end of the day, the two-party system it causes this very sclerotic form of government, because it puts us always at loggerheads and gridlock. And at the end of the day, what we're fighting against is not blue America, not against red America. It's about liberal democracy versus rising forms of illiberal democracy and authoritarianism around the world. That is the biggest fight. And in a way, because we cannot bury this gridlock at home, it's really hampering this actual, this global fight that's of far greater consequences to the survival of our republic than anything.
Yep. So I should add that the ballot access plan that you mentioned, Melissa, is probably the most likely option to work. It's not the only one. Ballot access at this point does involve partnership with some party that has access to ballots. Could be a major party. Could be that the Democratic Party discovers that it is unable to hide Biden's decline and that it fears a spectacular reversal in the polls after a bad showing in a debate. It's hard for me to imagine that the DNC would agree to this, but perhaps they would be overwhelmed by a spasm of patriotism that nobody sees coming and would embrace a unity ticket. The same thing could happen on the Republican side, or more likely, a collection of regional parties that have ballot access, not nationally, but in one part of the country or the other, could join together to put the unity ticket on the ballot. So there are various different ways it could happen. The easiest and most likely is probably the Greens and or Libertarians, and wouldn't it be marvelous if they were both interested in doing it? But it is, again, it's a matter of belief. And if we don't get there, the election is going to run, with no known way out, and we are going to be left with one catastrophe or another. The third parties will, as you point out, Matt, be blamed for the catastrophe, whatever it is. Mm-hmm. And so, how excited are we at rerunning 2016? I mean, that's pretty much what we're up to.
Oh dear.
It's even worse this time around, because the result, no matter what it is going to be contested far more vigorously even than it was last time. And people forget that we spent almost 3 years litigating whether or not Trump's election was legitimate. But this time around, it's going to be a national emergency, probably from the get-go, if it's anywhere close, depending on what the allegations are. So, yeah, there's a lot of potential chaos on the horizon. If we're just looking at a Trump-Biden scenario that's close heading into November, which is just really depressing. I think I can't remember feeling less enthused going, into an election season than this one.
And afraid.
Right. Yeah.
I'm actually afraid.
Right. Yeah, me too. I mean, it's frightening. We already see, hints of something Civil War-like breaking out in our cities, and I don't think anybody is under the misapprehension that those forces are going to disappear, especially if there's a close election result. I should say, to the extent that people try to understand what unity is, it's not a party, it's a movement. But it's a movement that's not about ideology. Obviously, everybody involved has something that probably stands as an ideology, but we've come together over something more universal, which is saving the republic, and that means fixing a lot of the structural problems that we are facing. So the unity plan, the power sharing arrangement that defeats the issue of spoiling elections, that's an example of a larger plan, which is to take all of the things that are wrong with the way we run elections and distribute power and correct them in one way or another. So, Matt, you raised the issue of the contested election and the debacle that could unfold in the aftermath of it. I should say, inside of Unity, we were playing with the idea that maybe there was a way to generate a solution to the paper ballot problem that we face, that there was basically, if one could offer an incentive, an X Prize style incentive for programmers to generate a secure, auditable, reliable app-based system, that unlikely that we could get it adopted before the election, but that the chaos that's likely to unfold after the election might cause people to be willing to adopt it if the thing was ready. Unfortunately, it was very hard to get partners to sign up for that plan, and so for the moment, it's on the back burner. But I would say that people should think of Unity 2020 and the Unity movement as it is becoming as a mechanism for addressing all of the structural flaws that have us tying ourselves in knots endlessly. There are a number of them, the Electoral College being another one, which was suddenly on people's minds again today. I saw Andrew Yang advanced an idea about the Electoral College. But all of these things are problems for which there is some sort of solution that can probably be generated that can save us from one debacle after another.
One thing I really like about it, and I remember doing a story about the Tom DeLay Congress and interviewing a lot of the members from different generations. Right, so the older members all talked about how back in the 60s and 70s and even going into the 80s, there was a system that was in place that was unwritten, but basically the idea was the two parties would say what they would make their public statements about each other during the week, but that the committee chairs and the ranking members would get together over the weekend. Their families would interact. They would play golf together. They would do other things. Mm-hmm. And then they would hash out what actually the fine print of each of the pieces of legislation would be, which amendments would go forward, which ones wouldn't. And by the early 90s, that system just completely evaporated as this new brand of politics came up, probably beginning with like Newt Gingrich, but now it's universal, where it's just nonstop combat. There's no question of actual, subterranean cooperation between these parties. They're legitimately just trying to undo each other constantly. And so what you're proposing is basically a structural solution to what was previously, an informal a mechanism that was in place just because they had a patriotic instinct to do things in the best interest of the country, right? Since that no longer exists, you have to come up with a structural way to get there. And I think it's interesting that this is an idea that could provide that.
Well, I didn't actually know that history. I mean, I guess I sort of know it because of the concept of the loyal opposition, which at one point dominated our structure, which is really about the fact that at the end of the day, there was patriotic agreement between the two parties that the nation's interests needed to be served. And that is, at some level, what has broken down. And I would credit that, and I have previously, to a shift in the Democratic Party when it basically abandoned the interests of working people and took up the cause of corporate interests that were maybe not so easily housed inside the Republican Party. And so basically now we have two corporate parties that are constantly rationalizing to the American people why we should still be paying attention to them. And that, I'm sort of imagining that in a prior era, there was always a tension between the interests of management and the interests of labor. And the fact is, neither one of those entities really wanted to win all the way. It definitely wanted a better deal. But at the end of the day, they both had to be sort of okay with the agreement in order for the work to get done. And at the point the Democratic Party walked away from the American worker, there was no longer any need for that because it was one industry against the other. So yes, this is a structural mechanism for restoring that kind of balance. And I have to say, Melissa, you're right. You don't see this in the parties except in these very rare exceptions, like like Dan Crenshaw and Tulsi Gabbard, who are actually friends, and they're not in the same place policy-wise. But I also think there's something to the fact that they both have military history, where this is sort of written into the military ethos that at the end of the day, the mission is what's important, and you can disagree over whether the mission is well thought out, but when the order comes down, you follow it because the overall objective is what has to be pursued. So
the greater good, right? Yeah. Well, I worry about two things. Well, the first one is, because the parties are so dominant, I think it would punish anybody that stuck his head out for this cause, right? So like, essentially, in a way, because Yang is probably the only one that is, and actually McRaven isn't either. But because both Dan and Tulsi are still part of the political apparatus, I worry that if they stuck their head out for this, that they would essentially, because the parties are just so dominant, be snuffed out, and that would be, that's kind of the sword of Damocles, like hanging over their head. Like it's going to be hard to kind of break out of that mold. And I don't know, whether you've talked to them about this and how to kind of solve it.
Well, if I did talk to them, I would recommend that they not embrace Unity 2020. The fact is, history will have to deliver an opportunity in which everyone will understand that they are doing their patriotic duty and they are working on all of our behalf to save the republic, or it won't. And if it doesn't, I don't want to see them damaged, because frankly, we're better off with a system that has them in it than a system that doesn't.
And out of it.
Yeah.
That's a good answer.
I mean, I spent a decent amount of time with Tulsi Gabbard during the primary season last year, and watched as some pretty despicable tactics were unleashed against her from the very beginning. If you remember, NBC News timed a story to be released on the day that she announced for the presidency that made this very logically spurious claim that she had some kind of connection to Russian bots that was, reverse engineered through, a series of assertions that really didn't hold up over time. But the press had that from the get-go. They called her an Assad apologist from the get-go. Nobody except for, I think, a couple of the candidates, if I'm not mistaken, it was maybe Bernie and Yang, stood up for her. And so she's already in a place with the Democratic Party that's not positive, and I think a lot of that had to do with she being off message about the party's stance on war. She was not a backer of the Mueller investigation and hype, and so if she were to even think about talking about it, entering the race, and they've already preemptively gotten on her case about this, because if you remember, there was a series of news stories predicting that she was going to do exactly that. Would probably be difficult for her going forward.
Yes, the stuff that was deployed against her was jaw-dropping. And I have to say, the invoking of this Russia stuff against her, I mean, in particular, not just invoking it, but as I recall, Hillary Clinton said some absolutely despicable stuff about
Russian
her
asset,
being an asset. And I just thought, what have we come to, that a patriot like this is being portrayed in that way by a member of their own party? And, that has, that has come back to me as I'm watching Unity be dismissed. The thing we got into with Twitter, which we will talk about here shortly, we were accused of being Russian bots too. And it's like Russian bot is now a euphemism for anything the Democratic establishment doesn't like, right? Russian not required. Bot, not required. If you are in any way associated with something it finds threatening, then it's going to tar you with that, Cold War stigma, and it's almost comical.
Yeah, but the problem is that it's effective. There were two new techniques that they unveiled in the last couple of election cycles. One was this idea of the anonymous leak to reporters that intelligence sources believe that the Russians have a preference for X candidate, right? Which is an unconfirmable story. It's impossible to refute. All you need is one reporter to buy it. And once they have somebody who actually has some kind of title, they can just run with that. And there's nothing the candidate can do once that's out there. Social media takes over from there. It gets a life of its own, and it worked. I mean, Bernie Sanders won the Nevada caucus in spite of it, but I think that hurt his candidacy overall. They unveiled that with him. And then the second thing was this concept of basically saying that a candidate's online following was toxic, and that the candidate himself or herself was responsible for creating or fostering the toxic atmosphere. This is like a new tactic that the party kept unveiling whenever they were dealing with somebody who was making a little bit of headway in the polls. They did it to Sanders. There was a little bit of it with Yang. We saw it with Ed Markey a couple of weeks ago. They definitely did it with Tulsi. And even though there were other candidates like, Kamala Harris with her K-Hive that were extremely aggressive online, the reporters bought these stories, and they're effective too, right? So they have all these weapons now to go after candidates who kind of step out of line, which you have to think about.
There's an extra layer of harm to that, this Russian bot excuse, and that is, I think it evades responsibility. So, for example, by blaming, say, like Trump won because of Russian bots, it kind of prevents the party from taking responsibility about deeper causes that have roots that caused his election, or that sort of created a fertile ground for a candidate like Trump to blossom. And in the same way, with any of these arguments about Russian bots currently, it's such a convenient excuse, and it just peppers over everything, and the party's able to just blame it on this foreign intervention, and not ask real questions and not be responsive to voters.
Yeah, they run these absolutely feeble candidates that inspire no one and invite all sorts of skepticism based on the fact that they basically represent corruption. And then they need somebody to blame it on. And I mean, what does it even mean that some nation has a preference for X candidate? Do we imagine that nations are somehow, not going to have opinions? Are we not supposed to have opinions on?
Right. They do. They clearly do. Yes,
they do. And so, yes, there's something. The public online has become so sensitive to the slightest hint that something is going to be stigmatized, and they flee from anything in which you've advertised that, that thing's about to get hit, and nobody wants to stand next to it. And the point is, it's made the game pretty easy for the parties. They can keep anybody out just by reserving the right to stigmatize anything that threatens them.
The other thing that's really absurd about that whole thing is, I lived in Russia in 1996 when we openly meddled in the Russian election. We had advisors who had offices in the Kremlin who were helping write Boris Yeltsin's campaign ads. And we had multiple vehicles for funneling money to candidates that we preferred, almost always over a communist. But the typical construction was to have, some kind of a nonprofit group that would technically be non-political and would be financed by USAID, and then they would do quote unquote democracy promotion advertisements. There was a very famous campaign in 1996 called Galasui Ili, which means vote or, right? The concept was, vote or lose, basically, right? But they never actually came out and say, don't vote for the communists, do vote for Yeltsin. But all the messaging was in that direction. And we spent millions and millions of dollars, of public dollars, openly supporting Boris Yeltsin. And that doesn't even get to the question of how we helped him through privatization schemes and other things like that. So for the United States to turn around and cry foul that countries are trying to lobby, even theoretically, for influence in the United States, which is like, the Rome of the modern world. Of course, everyone wants to influence the United States. It's laughable, really. But people buy it. So.
Well, I think we have to be aware of it, at least. I am very concerned about Chinese influence, for example, in our political system. So I think we still have to be like, yes, it exists, and the United States has done it too, to many other countries for a long time. But I don't think we have to make it so easy. At the end of the day, because we are an open system, it's very easily hacked, right? So you can have, like China, for example, bans its own citizens from using Twitter. But on Twitter, you'll find their wolf diplomats, their ambassadors chirping away. So yeah, influence operations are everywhere. But if people were confident in what they thought and what they, how they approach politics, they wouldn't be so easily swayed by these arguments by the parties, which can easily be co-opted and turned into this stick, where like, oh, these are just Russian bots, and kind of inflame a certain sort of like paranoia about it. So it's good to be aware, but also somehow, make people sort of realize that like this stuff happens all the time.
Yeah, just really quickly about that. A couple of weeks ago, I interviewed Thomas Frank, the author. He wrote this new book called The People Know, which detailed the history of like propaganda campaigns against the populist movement, and dating back to the late 1800s. And they've always the idea that the third party movement is susceptible to foreign influence is like an ancient idea in the United States. William Jennings Bryan was accused of being in league with the Russians. Even though FDR wasn't a third party candidate, he was accused of having populist ideas. And there are you can look back and find cartoons where he's got his hands stained red with the red jam of Moscow, right? So it's like not a new tactic. And I think that you combine people's the sort of lifelong propaganda that people hear about third parties not being real candidates with that implication. It can be powerful for a lot of people.
Third parties, movements, even, you see a lot of people, every time there's some sort of pro-democracy movement somewhere around the world, people are always trying to look into intent, right? Like who is funding this or who's bankrolling these people. And it kind of denies people their agency. And I guess the same thing is happening here, right? Like, so people are accusing Unity 2020 of being some sort of being influenced by Russian bots. And well, that quote, I think, Elizabeth Holmes said it too, so just beware. But that quote, first they say you're crazy, then they fight you, then you change the world. So that is they're fighting you. It's the Russian bot claim.
Yep, it's flak when you're over the target.
Right.
Yeah. No, I definitely have the sense that we are hitting a nerve, even if they don't see us as an electoral threat yet. There's something they are beginning to realize that the thing that they have needed to suppress in order to maintain their power is beginning to find a way around their protections. And so, we should expect more of that. Is it time for us to talk about what took place at Twitter?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, we should.
All right, let's talk about that. So I will give you a brief rundown. We will actually be releasing a internal review that describes all of the events and all of the findings. You guys have both seen a preview of that the final internal interview was conducted today. It didn't change anything substantial. We didn't learn anything that we didn't already know. So we're in the process of finalizing the report. What happened was, on the last day of the Republican convention, Unity 2020 engaged in amplifying a hashtag. The hashtag was something like just say no to Donald and Joe. And we did quite well. We were a little surprised at how well the hashtag did, but it trended on Twitter. And before we knew it, our official account was suspended. And then several other accounts that belonged to people in our movement were suspended. And we couldn't figure out what was going on. We did discover that many of the detractors who follow us around and say nasty things in the replies to all of our posts were proudly telling us that they had reported us to Twitter, this, that, and the other. They accused us of being Russian bots. And for some reason, Twitter seems to have listened. So at the point that we made contact with Twitter and asked them what was going on, they told us that the flagship account, Articles of Unity, had engaged in registering large numbers of fake accounts. These are accounts that would have been registered for the purpose of promoting hashtags only. And when we heard that, we were pretty sure that nobody highly placed in the organization had done this, but because Unity 2020 is all volunteer and there are literally thousands of us, we didn't know for sure that nobody had done it. So we started an investigation to see, and we found no evidence that this behavior had occurred. Certainly it didn't occur by the hand of anybody associated with the main account that was suspended, but we don't even find evidence that it occurred anywhere else. So I now have sole access to that account. I have filed the proper document to get an appeal to Twitter, and I've heard nothing back. So we are now a week out from the suspension, and obviously the clock is ticking for Unity, and this account was a primary mechanism for us to reach our supporters. And so what it is looking like is Twitter has engaged in a political act. Certainly with the data it has, it ought to know that what it's claiming we didn't happen. And yet there's no response from it. Oh, I should also point out, even more egregious than the suspension of our account was the fact that for quite some time, it was impossible to post a link to our website on Twitter. If you attempted to do it, Twitter sent you a warning and said that the website in question might be harmful, and it refused to post the link. Jack of Twitter, Jack Dorsey, eventually admitted that that was overreach, and they reversed it, and it is now possible to post that link. But something is going on inside of Twitter that appears to be political in nature and targeted at the Unity movement in the midst of an election. Thoughts?
I mean, it's crazy, and it's an underappreciated problem that there are this handful of internet platforms now has a chokehold on most of the news sharing, most of the discourse in this country. And if they're going to start making decisions about who is and is not a legitimate political voice, which they clearly have, then you just don't have an equal playing field anymore. And I first started writing about things like this about 3 years ago when if you remember, Facebook first started removing people for what they called coordinated inauthentic activity, and they zapped a whole bunch of accounts, and there was just total indifference on the part of the media, because they felt like, well, who know, these are small sites, it's not important. but the precedent turns out to be important, right? I mean, it turns out to be very important. And yeah, I think it's a huge problem. Obviously, these are private companies and they can do what they like, but they perform a utility-like function. And if they're going to have their thumb on the scale like this, especially if it's not transparent, it's going to turn politics into this sort of funhouse-like activity where it's really impossible to tell who's really got support and what's really going on.
So I hate to be like that guy, like the conspiratorial nut, but I think two things are sort of like triggering that. And that is the timing of this, right? Because this happened right when you got the hashtag to trend. So, and then the timing out from the election as well, which is it's crucial time for unity, because this is a numbers game. It's how many people can we get a belief in this, and just to really move the needle. It's very easy to shut it down just when it's starting to gain momentum, and that seems to be what's happening. So it's very hard to, I don't like to jump to those conclusions, but every now and then there are just all these things that you take into consideration when you hear a story, and it just seems hard not to go down that route and think that there's something of this nature going on, insidious, kind of behind the scenes.
Well, at some level, yeah, I want to push back slightly on what you said, Matt, about it's a private corporation. They can do what they want. The answer is, unfortunately, things like Twitter and Facebook are functioning as the public square, but they retain the rights of a private entity. And this is clearly not serving the interests of the public. So there's a question about, is it a platform? Is it a publisher? Does it have to stick to one set of rights and responsibilities, or can it dodge and weave between them? But I would also point out what they told us we've heard almost nothing from them besides what Eric was able to get from Jack back channel. But what we were told is that we triggered their spam protection. Right? But what does triggered their spam protection really mean? What it seems to mean is that somebody reported us. Of course, we have detractors. They can be relied upon to file reports over anything that we do. And if the idea is, well, once you've been reported, then behind the scenes, nobody can see what's going on, and they have discretion to do what they want. Okay, triggered their spam protection might mean we got reported by people who don't like us, have contrary political interests, which then allowed an opaque process behind the scenes to run. It generated an allegation that appears to be false, but because we can't see the actual allegation, there's no way to respond to it, nor is there any venue in which to respond to it. The whole thing amounts to total discretion for entities that are unelected and appear to control what we can discuss and what we can't discuss. Now, in thinking about that, I ran across a piece of information that I was unaware of, which is that Kamala Harris's former press secretary he's been working at Twitter for some time, but he's actually now in the communications division and plausibly involved in such decision-making, which seems a clear conflict of interest.
Sure.
And I actually think it represents, we've all heard about revolving door politics. And revolving door politics involves people who have been in the public sector, moving into the private sector, into the industries that they were regulating. But this seems to me like a new version of this, right? To the extent that the platforms play a gatekeeping role on discussion, the idea that somebody is going to move from a political operation into the inner workings of one of these platforms and decide what other political entities are allowed to speak and which ones are to be silenced seems to me, Orwellian, to not to put too fine a point on it.
Sure. Yep. I mean, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No. Go ahead.
I mean, the head of cybersecurity for Facebook is a guy named Nathaniel Gleicher, I think is the way we pronounce it. And he was in the National Security Council. he was their director of cybersecurity policy under Obama for, I think, 2 years, 2013 to 2015. So the idea between their partnership with groups like Facebook's partnership with groups like the Atlantic Council, the situation where the Senate dragged in Facebook, Twitter, and Google and demanded that they come up with a plan for preventing, fake news and inauthentic content and the sowing of discord. I mean, I would imagine that the Unity Party certainly qualifies as discord, right? That feels like a very unnatural mix of public and private. And people say that's not a First Amendment issue. So this is where you're right, probably right to push back on me saying that they're private companies and they can do what they want. They can't if they're being influenced by government officials, if they're being pressured by the Senate, right? So all those things are germane to what's happening, and it's frustrating.
Yeah, I'm not sure if there's a good long-term solution for this. At the end of the day, I think moving into the private sector is a very big carrot for anyone joining the government. So it's you talk about corruption today, and this is some sort of low-level version of it. And what it does is that it dissolves that separation between industry and government, that wall that's supposed to be there. It's regulatory capture. All these issues come into play. So it's something to look out for. But I don't know if there's really a solution. It's kind of like, it's free market at hand. This is just the carrot, the reward at the end of a very long, even it doesn't even have to be long. It's just the reward at the end of a political career.
Yeah, or is it even the end? I mean, it strikes me that this is a perfect lateral move, and that whatever, to the extent that Kamala Harris is the DNC incarnate, it has, extended a tentacle into a platform that dictates which ideas are viable and which ideas are somehow deemed to be unacceptable. The whole thing is a structure that can't possibly work in the long term. I mean, the fact is we have to have a public square, and either something like these platforms can function as a public square, in which case they have to do it fairly, or they can't function as a public square, in which case we have to move them out of the way in order to establish some place that we can actually talk. Because, I mean, frankly, the First Amendment protections that the founders gave us are limited to governmental interference in speech because the founders couldn't have conceived of a threat as big as tech platforms. And if they had, I feel certain they would have delivered us a protection for that as well. It's not on them that they didn't intuit what the 21st century would look like, but here we are, and the fact is we have to talk about the affairs of the nation and the corrupt duopoly that has blocked us from the ability to influence policy.
Yeah, I mean, we've never had a formal media regulator in this country, and now we have all kinds of hidden apparatuses that essentially function as media regulators, right? So you have Google tweaking its algorithm to decide which story comes up higher when you press in a search for X, Y, or Z, and we don't know what that algorithm is, and they're essentially making decisions about what we're going to see first. But this is even worse, where you have an unelected cadre of tech executives in some location where we don't even know where, making a judgment call about which is artificial amplification, which isn't, which warrants action and which doesn't. And if anybody who's been on Twitter knows that there are there are paid trolls all over the internet, and it certainly smells like the major parties have a hand in this, right? And we know sort of from anecdotal evidence that they've kind of talked about their investments in social media. There are groups like Correct the Record, American Bridge, but somehow that's legitimate. And yeah, it's just not right if they're going to end up making subjective decisions about who gets to be on these platforms and who doesn't. And it's just striking that there aren't more people worried about that.
I think transparency and accountability will go really far. The problem is that these, the means by which speech is regulated or content is regulated is so opaque. And the systems in which we have to report things, and escalate a claim like you've tried to do with Unity accounts, it's either non-existent or just arbitrary, and then we have to rely on bet channels. This is, again, we're lucky that you're backing Unity, but what if you didn't have that back channel? So again, it's privileging a certain set of people. Like average people could, like who just don't have access to that, they could have their entire accounts gone, and pretty much their means of participating in the public square, it evaporates. I think Facebook took some recent strides in countering this. They tried to come up with a sort of Supreme Court, right, where they put together like a bunch of people, and they separated from the executive function, and they said, okay, these are the people that are going to determine the policies and how, what content can and cannot be posted on Facebook. They're trying to get there, but it seems like no one was really prepared to handle this, and we're still not sure whether we want government regulation, because that introduces a whole new can of worms, or not.
Yeah, which is effectively exactly what the founders went through and settled on what is really a very counterintuitive right. The right to free speech means that you're going to have speech that isn't good for anybody that's protected. That's inherent to the nature of that particular right. But it is necessary in order to have, heterodox speech be protected, which it must, because all speech that's ahead of its time is heterodox in its time. So, at some level, we're reinventing a wheel. This is what, the founders missed a lot of stuff because they couldn't intuit what the future would look like technologically, but they got some other stuff very, very right. And this is one of the pieces they got right. They just didn't understand what context the protection would be necessary in.
Yeah, I think you hit it on the nail. You said, for truth finding, heterodox is absolutely necessary, because we don't know what the truth is until we kind of get there. And it's a process. The problem is, though, that, even the founders drew a line somewhere, right? There was fire in the theater line. Incitement or immediate danger, was it? Incipient danger. And in the case of online platforms right now, like even most free speech advocates would say some line has to be drawn. We won't allow ISIS to recruit or to put out propaganda. We won't allow the mosque shooter in New Zealand to post this video. So there's always some regulation. I think the issue is just when that regulation seems to really favor political speech or one side of it, that, and what the exact rules are. I think if just transparency and accountability will go a long way for these platforms.
Yep, I agree with you. And, obviously there are, you can't incite violence, for example, even under the First Amendment. But the stunning fact at the moment is that even mainstream views are unacceptable if one attempts to voice them on a platform that disagrees. The idea that, for example, the duopoly is a problem, that idea couldn't possibly be more mainstream, right? Everybody knows the duopoly is a problem, and yet somehow you challenge the duopoly and, surely you're a Russian bot, or you're inauthentic in some way, or this is a money-making scheme, or whatever the accusations are going to be. And somehow the wheels turn inside these organizations, and next thing you know, you're suspended. And, well, what are you supposed to do, right?
But these are empirical claims. There are IP addresses that can be looked up. you can check did the owners of the Unity 2020 official account, was there any nefarious activity? Why punish the main account for activity of its supporters? That seems to me really like that's the part that makes me question this and whether or not that's politically motivated.
Right. Twitter has better data than anybody. It took us a week to do a thorough internal analysis, but it's got the IP addresses right there on a screen if it wants to look at them. And the fact is, if what they're telling us is that something on behalf of Unity 2020 did something illegal or against the terms of service, and they're punishing our account for it, well, this opens up an entire other Orwellian possibility. All you have to do to sink an effort is to support it with something that violates the terms of service, and then the effort will be canceled. Right? We can't possibly open that loophole. I can't be responsible that nobody violates the terms of service on behalf of Unity 2020. I can be responsible for the terms of service for accounts that I control, right? But we have landed somewhere where the playing field is just unbelievably steeply slanted in favor of those who already have disproportionate power. And, it shouldn't really surprise us that we see something like revolution arising in our streets, because when the powerful freeze other people out, then, they make revolution. And in this case, we've got an incoherent revolution already on the march. So the irony is it is in their interest to allow responsible parties to offer an alternative to the corrupt duopoly, because if they don't, the alternative that we will get looks, to my eye, Maoist.
Yeah, we've already just to go back and talk about those shenanigans that you speculated about. I mean, we've already had instances of that have been reported on. That there was a group called New Knowledge that was one of the companies that was relied on as experts in the Russian bot affair. They testified to Congress, and the New York Times did a story where they, one of their executives talked about, essentially admitted to a scheme where they were synthesizing Russian influence in the Alabama Senate race, nonetheless, that company continued to be a source for major news reporters, even though they'd admitted to, faking levels of Russian influence in order to make somebody look like they were the recipient of Russian largesse. So, again, it's this landscape where it's really, really difficult to know what's reality and what isn't, and it's incredibly easy to create mischief for somebody, which is dangerous.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, we have arrived at the point. I think we should take a brief break, and then we should return. And we have a tool, Democracy AI, that people can use to give us questions, and we can in turn get information from them about what they're thinking. So maybe before we do that, I'll just say, is there any last things you want to say about the topics we've talked about so far?
Melissa, no?
No, but actually just wanted to point out that what you're talking about, Bret, about you can't be responsible for what happens on the main account. We can't hold a main account responsible for its supporters. That there was an effort called Google Bowling, which was you would do something sketchy on behalf of another, like somebody else's domain, and it was a way to kind of like sideline that domain. And there was a term for it, was called Google Bowling.
Google Bowling. I didn't know that, but yes, that's exactly the problem. And your supporters are one thing. You don't know if your supporters are going to do something they shouldn't, but your antagonists supporting you falsely with some sort of illegitimate tactic is an even bigger hazard, which I think is what you're talking about, Melissa.
Exactly. It's 3D chess. Yeah.
It's 3D chess. Yep. All right. So we're going to take how about a 5-minute break?
10 minutes.
10-minute break? I'm being told it's a 10-minute break. We'll take a 10-minute break, and then we will return, and we will talk to Unity supporters using Democracy AI. If you are watching this broadcast and you would like to participate, then you should go to, I don't see the button on the screen.
Hey, Bret, you can, for our audience out there, you can go ahead and click the link either in the button right below the video on the campfire.articlesofunity.org page, or in the link right in the description on the YouTube page.
Right. So on the YouTube page, it's in the description. And if you are full screen on the video, then go back to the campfire.articlesofunity.org page, and there is an active button that will allow you to log in. We will see you in 10 minutes.
Okay.
You got it.
Great.
In the meantime, be well. Hey, folks, welcome back to the Unity 2020 Campfire with Melissa Chen and Matt Taibbi. We are ready to go with Democracy AI, a very fancy tool that we are using to interact with our supporters to find out what it is that they want to know, what's on their minds. For those of you who can't see it, it is a tool that allows people to suggest answers and then essentially upvote answers that they like, so that the ones that are most worthwhile filter to the top, that sort of thing. Anyway, very high quality tool. We thank its authors for loaning it to us. Okay, Elizabeth, are you there?
I am here, and we're just waiting for a few more questions to roll in. We have about a minute and 40 seconds left for people to submit their questions.
A minute and 40 seconds. So let me just say, I forgot to say at the top of the broadcast that I, at the moment, am recovering from an interaction with a dental surgeon that has me swollen, if anybody is wondering. I will say, though, as bad as I look, the dental surgeon looks way worse. That was a joke, and I hope he's not watching. That was meant to imply that we had gotten into a fight, but that's not really what happened. He was actually fully licensed to do what he did to me, and as terrible as it's been, I'm getting better.
It's really not noticeable.
It's not noticeable
at all.
Oh.
Nope, I couldn't tell.
It's funny. My family has been making fun of me. They say it looks like I'm storing nuts in my cheeks, which, if I was going to cash nuts, I wouldn't start till the third week in September. That I know. It's too early. All right. So, Elizabeth, are we getting there?
Yes, we are. So we have some questions rolling in. So the way that Democracy AI works is that people submit their answers, and then people are asked to say which questions they prefer against each other. And so then we wait for the end for the percent agreements.
So they're it's like upvoting, right? It's kind of like Reddit.
Kind of, yeah, maybe.
So I once said it's kind of like Reddit too, and I got back an earful on the ways that it is not like Reddit, and I cannot remember the detail of the distinctions. Okay. But let's just say it's superficially like Reddit in the idea that it's supposed to drive the high quality stuff
to the top. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. All right. So.
Okay. So the top question is a question I'm not sure that we have the answer to, but it's how likely is it for one of the other parties to endorse our ticket?
How likely is it? Well, it depends what they mean by the other parties. I think it varies a lot between the parties in question. I think it's actually quite likely that smaller regional parties will see the wisdom of this. I think the logic is actually quite straightforward from the point of view of the Libertarians and the Greens, but the fact that they are down the road, have chosen candidates, may make it hard for them to switch gears. But I would implore them. There is no reason to very predictably arrive as, once again, a footnote to an election on which so much is riding. There's no reason to be blamed for spoiling the election, which is all but inevitable. And this is a historic opportunity. This is a moment at which, by banding together, we could do something the duopoly simply did not anticipate and failed to forestall.
Yeah. One of my observations about libertarians, and some of them are really good friends of mine, is that they really tend to vote on principle. And, if that's true, then the current ticket may not really appeal to them in that way. So I would say that I can't see that as likely at all, even though the current libertarian candidate really has negligible polling, like almost negligible support in the polling that we've seen.
Well, I do find it hopeful. I don't know if either of you saw the piece that Reason Magazine put out last week, but it did a very good job of placing the current election in historical context, much of which I didn't know. But
the Whig Party, right?
With the Whigs, yeah,
exactly. Yeah. The collapse of the Whig Party, which was the the birth of the Republican Party, for which Lincoln was the first presidential candidate. In any case, one of the things that was striking was that Reason interviewed me and it interviewed Joe Jorgensen for that piece, and they spliced it all together in a way that, Reason is obviously a libertarian magazine, and there is a possibility that there is an awareness inside libertarian circles about the unusual nature of this moment in history and the unusual opportunity. And if Reason magazine can see it, maybe Joe Jorgensen and the libertarians can see it also. And, really we're talking about a big upgrade in the power of the libertarians, which I think is right. As I've said elsewhere, I'm not a libertarian, but I think they have one big piece of the puzzle absolutely correct. And that is that liberty is a very special value. It's unlike the other values because it is integrative. That is to say, if you have given people real liberty, it can only be because you've solved their other problems, right? You're not liberated if you are in danger of being wiped out by medical debt, or if you have no access to food, or your job security is poor. So in some sense, aiming to maximize liberty is the right thing. The place where I differ with the libertarians is that you can't do this narrowly, right? Liberty is increased sometimes through regulation. For example, the ability to fly around the world is possible because you have very tight regulation of the way airlines and airports work. So it is regulation that liberates us to do it. But in any case, it'd be lovely if they saw the logic of it and came on board. Could be a whole different ballgame.
Agreed.
All right, Elizabeth.
So we have another question here. What do you see as the best / most productive action steps for Unity supporters to take at this point? Now that we have a ticket and we have ballot access plan, what's next from Melissa and Matt? What do you see as sort of the best way to proceed?
Wow. Well, Bret, first of all, what's your take on that?
It's a pity that I'm in a position to answer that more easily. But I would say really that this has to do with people talking to each other one-on-one, that actually the movement can grow spectacularly if people do a small amount of outreach very regularly. And what I would say is that many of us in the movement have noticed the following thing. It's very hard to make headway if you talk to a group because everybody's afraid of what other people in the group will think. If you talk to people individually, it's much easier to reach them, that they can allow themselves more freedom to acknowledge what it is they actually believe and to try out a new position without feeling like they're going to be chastised for it. So I would say the thing to do is to figure out who is most likely in your friend group to be able to hear the logic of this, and then talk to them. And, if you can pass along a message in which you convey to them, all right, now it's time for you to figure out who who could hear it, this could spread very, very quickly. But if we keep broadcasting to large numbers of people, it'll be harder because people's fears about being blamed for things are they're too prominent.
But knowing is one thing. Are you trying to drive them to the website, to engagement? I mean, like a hashtag, like what is the actual action?
Well, I think the action is spread the word. And the other thing, something Eric was very clear about when he was on our first Campfire, is you're not saying, I will support this. You're saying, if Unity delivers the opportunity to support it, I will do so. For example, you now know that the ticket we intend to draft is far and away better than either of the major party offerings. So if you have the opportunity to vote for it, will you? That's a relatively easy thing to convince people of. So yes, they should come to the website. They should give us their email address. But the really important thing is that mentally they acknowledge yeah, I'm ready for something different because I'm afraid of what the major parties have delivered us, and I'm willing to talk to other people about it too. I mean, that's the big ask because it involves social risk.
Right. And I guess it's also then like looking for people who are, journalists, influencers who are sort of that node in the network that can pump the message out to even more people and get the word out, given that traditional methods are failing us right now, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Or we're being censored. Yeah.
The more audience you have, the larger role you can play. So yeah. yes to that.
So we have another question, which I can answer. It's, have any Unity 2020 representatives reached out to any third parties to discuss ballot access? And the answer is yes. We're working hard. So just like Bret and Melissa said, we need to really increase our newsletter signups and just get the word out there more and have more one-on-one conversations. And Melissa, to your point about reaching out to influencers and different people who can amplify our message. Is there anybody that you would recommend to come on the show or that you would want us to invite to the campfire? And Matt, this question goes to you too. About 50% of our audience wanted to see if you two had any suggestions for future guests.
You should definitely hit up Joe Rogan, obviously. Right?
Joe who?
Joe Rogan, he needs to have you guys on. Yeah, I don't know. He moved to Spotify, so who knows about that? But
he moved to Spotify and he moved to Austin.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. But someone like him, who has a very very big following, but also a very heterodox, very big tent following. People that already are distrustful of mainstream narratives, and I think he inbuilt into his audience is already a distrust in the political system and the two-party system. Someone like that will be really helpful. And again, I don't know if he's had Dan Crenshaw on, but he's certainly had Tulsi many times.
He loves Tulsi.
Yeah.
Yep.
He said it would both her. Yeah.
He has had Dan on. I'm virtually certain I saw that interview, and I'm only now doubting it because you're not certain. But yeah, I believe he did.
Or like Bill Maher, someone like that who could. I mean, he's totally mainstream, right? So.
Well, he is. One wonders, though. In Joe's case, it's different because Joe really is. He's built his own podcast. I hate to say empire; it's such a terrible term, but he's built his own institution, really. Bill Maher, on the other hand, I don't know how free he is. I assume he's free enough, but it's a little hard to say because he's embedded inside, a corporation that may have a different view. But anyway, those are good suggestions. I hate to put you on the spot, Matt. Did you?
Yeah, Michael Tracy. I mean, it's an internet like a Twitter gadfly, but he's a major Tulsi person, and he has a significant following online, and no love lost for either of the two parties. So, him, maybe Glenn Greenwald. I mean,
Glenn. Yeah.
I think it would be tough for Glenn to come out and say that he's not going to vote for the Democrat, but he's certainly been protective of Tulsi in the past. I think he's got a lot of reservations about both parties. It would only take a couple of people of significant profile to say, I'm considering not voting for Joe Biden because of this, for it to become a significant news story, right? And then you have to wonder whether you want that kind of attention or not. But it would be interesting for sure.
Yep, and I must say, I'm privately hearing those things.
Really?
Not from people who have any interest in saying that, but I think the hazard of a president who might not be mentally fit, coupled with the hazard of partnering with this dangerous movement in our streets, has got people really spooked.
Recently, Rose McGowan kind of came out against the DNC almost. She's been really rallying against the party. But kind of look at how she's treated, or in her mentions, just mainstream Democrats kind of going after her for that.
Yep. If I can couple the last two questions, though, people wanted to know what they can do, and then there's a question about reaching out to the parties. One thing that people can do is they can reach out to the parties, and they can let the parties know that actually this is something that we want. We want you to rise above your party affiliation at this moment and step in and save the republic, because really, some level, the ball is now in those parties' court. So if we can persuade them that, hey, there really is an opportunity here, and you will be understood to be doing something patriotic and very positive, then they may hear it very differently.
Right.
How much, Bret, have you come up against with the parties? Like, I know that this has been a problem in the past where some of the third parties or non-mainstream parties have been reluctant to bring on a bigger name or a bigger profile effort because these are basically pretty small little sinecures that are comfortable for a clubbish group of people who are perfectly happy drawing 2%. And sometimes it's tough for those types of organizations to break out of the mindset of what they've been doing for a long time. Has that been an issue?
Well, I'm sure it's an issue. On the other hand, it's 2020. We've all got internet access. We know how dangerous this situation is. And either one looks at that and thinks this isn't about me, or you look at that and you think this is the moment I have to do whatever is in my power, because everything depends on us finding some way out of this. So let's put it this way. I know there are people within those parties who can see that. And I think it's their moment. They have to raise the alarm and say, look, this is new. This is very dangerous. And we hold a card if we wish to play it. If we do the usual thing, we will not be able to change history. If we do something unusual at this moment, we very well could. And, the nation won't forget.
So, and to your point, Bret, this final question I think speaks to that. How do we show that the move to draft the Unity 2020 ticket to the Libertarian or Green ballot is symbiotic rather than parasitic?
Yeah, I don't know if that's responsive. Somebody had argued that it was a parasitic move on our part, and I corrected them on Twitter, pointing out that this was actually a mutualism. How do we establish that? Well, there is the simple fact that the third parties, are very unlikely to attain 5% of the vote on their own, which means they will be stuck in the same predicament next time that they're in this time. If they attain 5%, or well more than that by virtue of joining with Unity, then they're in a whole new ballgame, because they will have federal electoral funds. It would have been $20 million in this case, I believe. So they are in a position to calculate themselves, because they are a third party and they know where those thresholds are and they know how much is on the line. They're in a position to calculate how good this could be for their future efforts. They also can see that we are good to our word about ranked choice voting. We were very careful to use ranked choice voting in picking our Unity ticket. And so they know that ranked choice voting, because it beats first past the post voting, is the key to third party power in the future. So at some level, we are walking the walk. They can see it. And this is very clearly in their interest if they want it to be. On the other hand, to Matt's point, if they're comfortable playing the same role election after election, then maybe this won't appeal to them. But I know that in their shoes, it would certainly appeal to me. All right, Elizabeth?
Let's see. I think
I'm actually curious, are the regional parties on the ballots of all 50 states, or?
I believe the way it works, there are many regional parties, by the way. The regional parties are, none of them have national reach, but there are many combinations that would provide access to all of the ballots in the country. So there are plenty of pathways that look like that. It just involves a whole lot more, collating and puzzling together a complete slate, but it can be done, and maybe that's the way to do it. Go ahead.
So we have, I just want to be respectful of everyone's time. I know it's late, particularly on the East Coast. So this last question is, how can we bypass word of mouth? And so what I'm interpreting this as is what can we do to really get our message out to as many people as possible? A lot of concerns are about time and about, reaching the most amount of people. So what do you three think we can really do to amplify these efforts in the most effective way? Which we might have already covered, but just to reiterate as the close.
Yeah, I don't know if just relying on social media is adequate. I mean, it is good, but again, we don't want to fall into the same trap of the Twitter distortion. And I think, have you guys ever thought of running ads or anything? Or, just trying to get the word out in more mainstream ways?
Yes. Now, the problem is, so far we have run as a completely volunteer organization, and we have dodged the many obstacles that come along with soliciting funds. It's probably
which is why anyone calling you grifter is just flat out false, because you're not taking a cent.
Not only that, but I will say there were plenty of places where it apparently would have been acceptable for us to collect money. For example, monetizing videos that we put out, where we didn't do it, so that it would be absolutely clear to people that this was not about personal enrichment or anything like that. This is a patriotic effort, and we were willing to pay the price to make it happen. You are right, Melissa, that probably the way to do this going forward involves spending money to reach people in other ways, and that comes along with costs. But I think at this point, probably the cost benefit marshals in that direction, and we are certainly moving ahead with an organization that will have the ability to do that in a way that is in concordance with the FEC. All right. Matt, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say the news cycle's so short now that it's not like it would have been 20 years ago or 20, or 30 years ago, where coming in this late in the game and not having an outreach network or a door-to-door network or a get out the vote network or phone banking network in place, like on a massive level, basically automatically rules you out as a serious candidate. This is basically a virtual campaign already because of the pandemic. And it's an extraordinary situation where both of the candidates have such incredibly high negatives that the introduction into the race of anybody who seems like a realistic or viable or logical option could pretty quickly become a factor that's significant. So it could hinge on a couple of media stories. It could hinge on, let's say, for instance, that Tulsi and Dan embrace this, right, and make a joint appearance or something along those lines. Really, what all it would take is a couple of days of intense news about this to be a factor. It seems like to me.
Oh, I absolutely agree with that. It doesn't take much. Something can go viral in no time whatsoever. And maybe to close this out, the thing to say is, if you're watching at home, this involves you, right? This is a question of bringing people who wouldn't be voting to the table and bringing out all of those who are finding themselves in an impossible position, voting for whichever party it is that is expecting them to show up. All we have to do is just simply say, we can't do it. It's not our fault. We've been left in a predicament that's absolutely untenable. And so we're going to go with the one thing that makes sense. What makes sense is unity. What makes sense is acknowledging that we collectively have interests that transcend whatever it is the parties are trying to sell us. And if we can do that, this is actually just a simple question of having the imagination to see it and the courage to say it. All right, so I think with that, we have reached the end of our campfire. I want to thank both of you from the bottom of my heart for seeing this, for having the vision to see what unity potentially represents, the courage to show up on our behalf, and for all of the insight that you have brought to the table. And to you at home, please consider who it is that you might know who has ears to hear, and talk to them. Maybe talk to them one-on-one and see if they can be brought to whatever it is that you've already recognized. All right. Elizabeth, thank you very much for manning Democracy AI behind the scenes, and we will see you on our next campfire. Be well, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much. Okay, bye.